In this short video, I would like to explain the difference between summative and formative assessment. This is a really important concept because when you write module descriptors, usually you put in just the summative assessment. But the question always arises, how do we facilitate students learning towards being able to complete the summative assessment successfully? How do we get them to practice what they need to be able to do by the end of the module, during the module? And that's where formative assessment comes in. So formative, that word, formative, refers to it being a formative assessment in the sense of learning. It forms, it helps form the student. So it's an educational assessment. Mostly, formative assessment does not count at all towards the end grade for the module. It's an opportunity for students to practice, to submit some work, and to get some feedback. That is really the most important thing. The most important thing about formative assessment is that it gets the student to spend time on task that is relevant to the module outcomes, to the module assessment, and to get feedback on how they're doing. Now that feedback doesn't have to come from you. You could design a formative piece of assessment that is either a self-assessment or it could be a peer assessment. So in a self-assessment, you would work with the students on formulating criteria for feedback. So you could work with your students, you could ask your students, well, what do you think needs to be in this piece of work? And you could work together on formulating and articulating 2 or 3 criteria for a small piece of work, say 500 words as an initial draft of an essay, for example. Then, using these criteria, you could ask students to look at their own work and give themselves feedback against those criteria on what they need to do better next time. There's no grade, there's no high stakes, it is purely a learning experience. And of course you can extend that, so instead of self-assessment, you can do peer assessment. You can ask students to look at each other's work. And there is a very robust research that shows that when students look at each other's work and when they engage in that way with the criteria, in other words, they have to apply the criteria to someone else's work, they hugely benefit from that experience because they suddenly see much more clearly what's required in the assessment. They are no longer passively submitting work, waiting for you to make a judgment. No, they're actively involved in judging each other's and their own work, without it counting, without there being any risk of failure. So that is the difference between summative and formative assessment then. Summative assessment generally comes near the end of a learning experience and measures the learning for a grade and for a final feedback. It is high stakes and the students often are very worried about it, but the summative assessment is a fair and reliable measure of the extent to which students have met the learning outcomes. Formative assessment is meant for learning. It's also called assessment for learning. It is designed so that students can practice the skills, the knowledge, the ideas that they need to assimilate during the module so that they can do well on the summative assessment. So you can see that if you design your modules and your learning experiences to include points of formative assessment, in whatever way you do that, preferably where it doesn't involve you, you could take maybe a sample of some of the things, some of the scripts that have been marked formatively, but you could set it up so that they self-assess or peer assess. You can see that the advantage is going to be for you and for the students that by the end of the module they're much more likely to do well on the summative assessment, which means fewer students fail the module, which means less work for the students, less work for us. So to sum up, summative assessment for a mark, formative assessment for learning towards better achievement on the summative assessment. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. If you've got any questions, then please email me.